I don't think Phil Espin needs a great deal of introduction. I think we all know who Phil is, or we will have heard of him. Long time birder in Lincolnshire and chair of the Lincolnshire Bird Club. Brilliant time in there. Excellent. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Phil. And I'll just check online, Roger, that you'll be able to pick up that if when Phil starts speaking in a minute, if you can give a thumbs up, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you everybody for coming and listening to me, giving me a chance to bat on about one of my newest and favouriteest hobby horses, Great Bustards. I'm born and bred in Lincolnshire, as Nick says. I've lived here all my life. I've been birding for around 50 years in the county, since I was a child, really. And there's been a lot of changes over that period, and even more over the previous 350 years, which some of you will know more about than me, but not all of them by any stretch. So I'm here today to talk about some of the enigmatic species we've lost over that period of 400 years and suggest what we could do to get some of them back, maybe, if we really want to. That's if we can get past shifting baseline syndrome, which is a great little phrase that I'll talk about more in a minute. Birds are an important part of our lives and our heritage as well. They're, a big part of our culture, really, and a particularly big part of my life, and I'm sure they're a big part of lots of your lives as well. But sadly, that's not so for the majority of the population, and many British people are just becoming more and more disconnected from wildlife and the natural environment. And there's an increasing tendency to squeeze out nature, despite all our conservation efforts. We see that in farming, often for reasons of profit, taking out hedges still, draining marshes, ploughing grassland and wild corners to grow more crops, replacing ancient woodlands and other habitats with commercial forestry plantations, chemicals to kill weeds and insects, until there's no food for birds to feed their young at all and their population has declined. We see it in towns too, not just the countryside, concreting and paving gardens, laying astroturf, stopping birds nesting on our houses by putting these horrible little things so house martins can't nest, poking house martins' nests down, blocking all the holes up in the roofs. Most lawns have to be manicured so they're almost devoid of life. It's councils as well, not just farmers. They mow verges and they cut hedges to an inch of their lives. And then we've got the dog walking community and the cat keeping community, who are, some of them are responsible owners, but some of them are a bit of a plague on our wildlife as well. And generally, Ben MacDonald, in his excellent book Rebirding, which I know some of you will have read, sums up, it's almost like a British disease, excessive tidiness syndrome. We tidy up everything to make it nice and neat, and for some people it's almost like a mental illness and it goes too far. There's no thought about wildlife, it gets squeezed out. It's been increasingly like that over the last 250 years, and it comes at a big price in lost biodiversity. Shifting baselines is a type of change to how a system is measured against previous reference points, which may themselves represent significant changes from an even earlier state of the system. So I remember what it's like in the 70s when I really started birding. There were lots of small birds about. It was just before the agricultural changes of intensification that came about after we joined the EU. And that's my baseline, really. A younger person today will have his baseline of the last 10 years, and they'll be looking to preserve what we've got now in the future. Whereas I'd be looking to preserve what we had in the 1970s, and maybe some of you would be looking to preserve what it was like in the 1950s. Each generation, things shift along. And the problem is we're circling down the plug hole, and the whole situation is getting worse and worse and not better. It's a really big problem in Britain, particularly because we're supposed to be the most nature depleted country in the world, and possibly in Lincolnshire, one of the most depleted counties in the most depleted countries in the world. So think about that. So talking about what we've lost, and particularly the birds, the breeding birds I'm emphasizing here. This is a horrible graphic, and I apologize for the quality, but it's just something I drew up to show the birds we've lost and when we've lost them and where from. So our Fenland birds starting with spoonbill and other birds like black-turned, spotted crake, black-tailed godwit. You could add ruff in there and even savage warbler maybe, although there's no proof it ever bred. We've lost all those breeding birds and they've not returned. In woodlands, we've lost much more recently in the last 100 years or so, wryneck, black grouse, wood warbler, pied flycatcher, hawfinch, and more recently redstart. And in the grassland heath areas, we've lost great busters, hen harriers, stone curlews, redback shrikes, and windchat. And the remarkable thing about most of these birds is they're all still with us to some degree. We get them on migrations, some of them summer, some of them winter. For instance, the spoonbill, it is probably the bird that we lost longest ago, but it's still, well, in the last 30 years or so, it's become an increasing migrant and has started to summer. And in the last 20 years, it started to breed again in places like Norfolk and Yorkshire. And we're very hopeful that it might breed in Lincolnshire in the next 10 years. Fingers crossed, we'll soon find out. But these are the main habitats that have been affected most by agricultural intensification and commercialisation of woodlands. But the ones that I really want to focus on today are the grassland heaths. So I'm not really going to talk about any of these birds from the fens and the woodlands. I'm going to focus on grasslands and the heathlands. And the bird that I'm particularly interested in is the Great Bustard, which is one of the finest and earliest victims of this agricultural intensification. And sadly, although most of the species I put up on that chart before, we see them most years, not the Great Bustard, it hasn't been seen in Lincolnshire since 1902. I should add all the pictures that I'm going to put up of Great Bustards. None of them are my own. I've taken them all from the Great Bustard Group website, which I'll be talking about as we go along. And I'm a member of the Great Bustard Group as well. So the Great Bustard lives across Europe, Asia, and North Africa these days. And it's a striking bird. I mean, has everybody seen one in the wild? I guess some of you will have. All right. So not everybody by a long shot, but it's a magnificent bird. And I should say that I became partly acquainted with Great Bustard as a child from a specimen in the Louth Museum. And when I went to university in London, there was one that occurred in Kent in 1978, in January 1978. And I got on the train because I didn't have a car in those days. Went down and spent all day looking for it. And it was pointed out to me at dusk as a very small speck in a field about 2 miles away, which I could see a lump, but I couldn't even see that it was a bird properly. So I never counted it. So I had to wait 20 years till I managed to catch up with one in Spain. Now, the best information we've got about Great Bustard in Europe at the moment is from the European Breeding Bird Atlas, which was published in 2022, last year. And Spain's relevant because Spain's got 80% of the population of breeding Great Bustards in Europe. If you look at the map here, down here, Spain, that's got a large population. There's a very small relic population in Germany, which a lot of conservation efforts are being put in to save. There's a population on the Austrian-Czechoslovakian border. There's a larger population in the Hortobagi of Hungary. And then going further east, there's quite a good population still in southern Russia on the steppes. And even further east, there's a population in China as well. So one of the interesting things is that the Great Bustard is still surviving in the original habitat they lived in was the steppe, so natural, open, dry grasslands. But in Western Europe, it's increasingly survived very well in arable agricultural landscapes, modern arable farming landscapes, because the birds can feed on oilseed rape and alfalfa and other cattle forage crops, so they can survive quite well. And it's been discovered that, the idea that Great Bustards need wide open plains and be able to see the horizon is not really true. In Russia, they've been found to breed within 300 meters of plantations. In Spain, they nest successfully in arable crops. So, and they're reckoned to be more vegetarian than they used to be. It used to be thought that they needed quite a big proportion of insects and even reptiles in their diet, but now it's recognized that they can, apart from when they're chicks, they can survive quite well on a vegetarian diet alone. Excuse me. So there it is. That's where it is today, but it's difficult to believe that 200 years ago, that magnificent beast roamed the plains of, or the wolds of the Lincolnshire. And I want to tell you a little bit about the history of the Great Bustard in England. So this is a reconstructed map from historical records of Great Bustard distribution in Britain. And unfortunately, the documentation in Lincolnshire, although it was known to breed in Lincolnshire, is not great. There's some quite good documentation from Yorkshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, and down into Wiltshire and Oxfordshire and the Downs in Sussex. But sadly, the Lincolnshire writers really didn't get into it at that time. We didn't have enough early ornithologists who documented what we got at that time. So the birds were particularly found on chalk wold land. You can see the Yorkshire wolds up here, the Lincolnshire wolds here, the Norfolk sort of woldy areas. But they also occurred on sandy wastes and heaths. So they were quite, one of the last places they hung on was the Brecks on the Suffolk and Norfolk border. So that's where they were thought to be when they gradually went out in the beginning of the 19th century. And as I say, that's based on historical records. There's controversy about when the Great Bustard sort of really first started breeding seriously in Britain. The archaeological record is not very good. There are bones from the Cheddar Gorge from around 12,000 years ago, which suggests that it did make it here while Britain was still connected to Europe at the end of the last ice age. And there's also bones from the Mesolithic period around 9,000 years ago from the Gower Peninsula when Britain was supposed to be covered in trees, but that's a debate that's raging at the moment between ecologists as to exactly how much it was covered by trees and how much it was a more open sort of savanna type landscape. We honestly don't know. There's limited bones from Roman times, i.e. there's one bone being found at a place called Fishbourne near the Sussex Downs. And there's a bone from London from the medieval period as well. So if it was present in that period, it was very scarce. But when writing started, there was no mention of it for some years. And what's very critical for some people is that the Anglo-Saxons didn't have a word for bustard, suggesting that it was not familiar to them in that period from 500 to 1000, 1100 AD when Anglo-Saxon was a predominant language in Britain. So it didn't really start to become, the first document, written mention of it in the English language was not until 1371. And from around 1450, it became more frequently mentioned in lists of birds consumed in medieval feasts and banquets. And it became especially prominent from the early 1500s. Unfortunately, they seem to be the only documentary records that have survived. So this has given rise to the theory that Great Bustard, though it may have been present in the earlier periods, recolonized Britain following the Black Death in the 1350s. That was the greatest of plagues to hit Britain, and it led to the reduction of the human population by half to 1/3, from around 5 million to 3 million, and the abandonment of settlements, particularly in the countryside. So just to give you a flavour of this, this is a map of Lincolnshire from the 1350s, and each black dot on the map is a deserted village. And these villages were partly deserted because of the Black Death, and partly because from around 1300, the British wool market became really important to trade, and selling wool was a major way to make money. And apparently from 1300 onwards, landowners started to clear people off the land, much as they did in Scotland many hundreds of years later, and replace them with sheep for growing wool for selling abroad. So the Black Death hit these communities that were already being thinned out, so that, you know, by the end of the 14th century, 1400, 1450 onwards, most of the wolds was quite a big open grassy sheep walk. And there are reports of people riding 30 miles across the wolds at that time. I'm not seeing a tree even, it was that open and grassy. So, and that persisted for quite a long time. You know, and Bustards had a heyday really from about 1400 to 1750, when the population spread around Britain and they were doing really well on the wolds. Although I'm implying they were doing really well on the wolds. I haven't got any documentary evidence to show that. No atlas is done in those days, sadly. But they were definitely there. And the Great Bustard, one of the enigmatic things about it is it's the heaviest flying bird. And even though it's the heaviest flying bird, it's a very strong flyer as well. And, you know, the birds can move around to avoid predation risk or even migrate in some climates as they wish. So just harking back to those times, this is a bit of fancifulness on my part, really, by calling this, the first map, road atlas of Britain was Ogilvy's map book of 1675. And he showed at that time that the main road from, well, it started at Lincoln down here, cut across the Market Raise and then went straight across the Wolds to Grimsby, was this purple marked dotted line, not the A46 as it is presently. And this purple mark dotted line went straight across the top of the Wolds, this highest part here. And it was probably in use from at least Anglo-Saxon times, so it was a very ancient road. And the existence of this road was drawn to my attention by a Louth historian who writes a very good blog called Caitlin Green. The blog is caitlинgreen.org, and she's from Louth, but she's a professor of archaeology at Oxford University, and she just in her spare time muses on these things, and she put this route on, and a lot of this route follows modern day roads up to about here, but then this bit in the middle here is where Binbrook Airfield was built in the First World War. And so if you go to it today, you can track virtually all of the routes across. And I did that last spring. And so it's all public rights of way, apart from the right of way across Binbrook Airfield, hasn't been reinstated. So I'm not stating that I walked across without permission, but I did get from one side to the other. And the thing about it is, when you go up there, and you're standing in the middle of that vast expanse of open wold with very few hedges and very few trees in sight, it's very easy to believe that Great Bustards were roaming around that landscape. And my first encounters with Great Bustards were on the steppes of Extremadura, near Torregas in about 1998. And they go very well with grassy open steppes and sheep. And I could really see them in my mind's eye, but sadly not in reality. So that's just a bit of romanticism on my part, really. The most interesting thing to me is that Thorganby, which is just here, just north of Binbrook, was said to be the home of one of the last two droves of Great Bustards in Lincolnshire. So the other one was supposed to be at South Rawsby. Now, this is interesting because I have read this somewhere or been told it, and I can't find the reference anywhere. And it's really galled me for the last 2 years that I can't find the reference anywhere. So if anybody else knows of that reference, I'd be very grateful if you could remind me, because I've read it sometime in the last 30 years. And I've been through lots of books I've read in the past, but I can't find it. And the other possibility is that Keith Atkin, who was one of the joint authors with Steve Lorando, The Last Birds of Lincolnshire, published in 1989, did a hell of a lot of background research for his book that never made it into his book. And I used to chat to him about these subjects quite a lot. And it's possible that he's told me about it, and Graham Catley reflects the same information, so he may have told Graham as well. But that account, wherever it is, has never made it into the mainstream ornithological literature. And to get it would actually help us to rewrite the story of Great Bustard, Lincolnshire, and put a bit more flesh on the bones, as it were. So, as I say, last known drove of bustards probably lived in this area. And even though it's a modern agricultural landscape, the evidence from Spain is that, given the right protections, that bustards can survive in that sort of landscape still. So, why did we lose them then? So if they could survive here now, why did we lose them in the first place? Well, you could say it's nothing to do with climate change, but this is one, but what is it? It's an interesting point. Great bustards are really tough birds. They can live in very cold environments and much icier environments than we have in Britain. They survive on the southern Russian steppes, which are particularly cold and icy. And would have been 350 years ago, our ancestors were surviving through what was, well, became known as the mini ice age, the Maunder minimum. Are you familiar with that? It was when the Thames froze over, and it was a very icy cold period in Britain from around 1600 through to maybe early 1830s, something like that. It's a really cold period. So you can see why in that really cold period that people started to dig up a lot of coal and use it to keep warm. And it was partly that fueled the Industrial Revolution, that need for getting coal out and keeping people warm. So that exploitation of coal led to the Industrial Revolution. And around 250 years ago, things were beginning to change very fast in Britain, and not just in the industrial urban areas, but in the countryside as well. In the 18th century, the rural population was booming, and more people needed more food, and legal changes in Parliament were brought in to allow an agricultural revolution to happen. Vast open areas of land and common were enclosed under the Enclosure Acts, and open downland and gorse-covered waste, as it was called, became fields. So all that habitat that the Great Bustard roamed over so freely, a lot of it was put under the plough and became much more intensively operated. And in that time, 250 years ago, Lincolnshire wolds were at the forefront of the agricultural revolution in Britain. And loads of people came to study them and find out what was going on. And what they were doing was ploughing up the land, which was reasonably fertile for the time, because it hadn't been exploited for such a long time. And it had quite a few hundred years of sheep muck on it. And they were using row crops to, like turnips, and folding sheep on them so that the sheep would intensively eat the turnips, and their manure would fertilize the land and growing a crop on it. Maybe only growing a crop every 1 or 2 years, but that was much more productivity than they'd had before, and that provided the food that Britain's growing urban and rural population needed. So what was another consequence of that? Well, it caused a number of issues for bustards. There's a lot more disturbance for a start. Sorry, this is just an indication of how quickly this change happened. So this is just a table showing the amount of enclosure that took place in each decade from 1760 through to 1836. So you can see there was a really massive boom in enclosure between 1760, 1780, and then it fell back for a bit. Then from 1800 to 1820, there was another big boom. So by 1820, most of the land was enclosed. So that was a period in which we lost the bustards. And the reason, well, what probably led to the initial population fall was that great bustards have a very simple nest. They just excavate a small scrape, lay 2 eggs, maybe in a crop or in a grassy area, and that's it. And with the advent of this, what was then modern agricultural practice, it needed big gangs of labourers to hoe the row crops. So people would be walking across fields in big lines hoeing the crops. And that made, apart from the disturbance, that made it very easy for them to discover busted eggs and nests. Remember, these are poor people who are getting paid a day rate for labour and are very hungry and don't know if they're going to be able to eat that night. You see 2 of those, about 6 or 8 times the size of a hen's egg, you're going to be feeling as if you're going to be having a good tea that night. And that's probably what caused the initial big drop in the population. But then what really put the nail in the coffin was the introduction of the breech-loaded shotgun. Great bustards are very wary birds, and they're not easy to shoot with the old muzzle-loaded guns. But with the advent of shotguns and the ability to reload quickly and have several shots, great bustards became a tasty treat for the table. And by 1810, last breeding busters in Lincolnshire had almost certainly gone. I'll say almost certainly because we just don't honestly know, but John Cordeaux, who I'll talk about in a moment, believed that they went around the beginning of the 19th century. The first documented record we have of the great bustard in Lincolnshire in the modern era is one shot near Louth in 1818. We don't know if it was a lone bird or the exact circumstances of this bird. It might have been one of the relics of the Lincolnshire breeding population, or it might have been a visitor from other parts of southern England, because great bustards hung on in the Brecks and in Salisbury Plain and areas like that, probably until the 1840s or 50s, although the last confirmed breeding record seems to have been in the Suffolk Brecks in 1832. The problem was, you know, people weren't that interested at that time, so not that many records were made. So John Cordeaux, who was born in 1831, just after the great bustards had gone, writing the first book on the birds of Humber district, that was effectively the first book on Lincolnshire's birds, in 1872, summarised the situation like this. Formerly inhabiting alike the desolate walls of Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, this magnificent species has passed away, leaving in this county scarcely a tradition of its presence, which are very poetic words in my mind. But so these days, the only place you can see a great bustard in the walls today is the one at the Louth Museum that fired my interest as a child. And this is a picture that John Clarkson took of the great bustard specimen in Louth Museum when we were preparing the birds of Lincolnshire. It's in the book. And Louth Museum kindly gave us access on a day when they were closed to get that picture. I have to say that isn't the one that was shot near Louth in 1818. It's probably a bird that was collected in Spain at the beginning of the 20th century. So there's no other Lincolnshire connection to it. Sorry. So really, in the period after that bird in 1818, there were 7 further records documented until 1902. And as I say, there's been none since 1902, although there have been records in other parts of the country. There have been records in Norfolk and Suffolk, and that record in Kent that I mentioned missing when I was a student. But Cordo's description is based on his experience of North Lincolnshire. And I mentioned that reference to a last possible drove in South Roresby in the reference that I can't find. And there is a bit of a tradition in South Lincolnshire. This is the Bustard Inn in South Roresby. It was built in 1860. And it's allegedly called the Bustard Inn because there's a hill nearby called Bustard Hill, where allegedly the last bustard in what they claim was the last breeding bustard in England was killed in the 1830s. Now, unfortunately, the specimen doesn't exist. There's no historical record of that, and there's no backing at all to support the story, which is a nice story, and it's one of only 3 bustard inns in Britain. And together with that suggestion that one of the last droves in Lincolnshire was in the South Roresby area, there is a few sort of bits of circumstantial evidence that you could try and hang a story together on, but it's very difficult. It's quite possible that Great Bustards not only bred in the Lincolnshire wolds, but on the sort of heaths around Sleaford, going all the way up to Scunthorpe, or where there were sandy heath areas. One of the only documented records in Lincolnshire in something like the 16th or 17th century is at Broughton. And Broughton, I don't know if you know it, it lies just the east of Scunthorpe on the road up to Wintringham. And young birds that were caught for the table there could equally have come from the sandy area around what is now Scunthorpe or from the wolds. So who knows? It's just impossible to say. And also, this same Caitlin Green, when I got talking to her about Great Bustards, I knew of an old hunting lodge at where was the place? Lawton, which is part of what is now Lawton Forest, but was originally part of that northwest Lincolnshire sandy waste area. And there's a hunting lodge there with a Great Bustard in, shot in 1850. Allegedly, it's not in the official records. Cordo didn't know about it, didn't mention it. It's not in the zoologists or anything like that. So whether it was a genuine record of a bird shot locally, or whether it was another of these specimens brought in from Spain and somebody said, oh yeah, that came from Lincolnshire, we just don't know, and we probably never will now. What's really interesting is that this is from a very great facility on the Collins website, which allows you to see how a word has been used in the English language since 1708. And this is the use of the word bustard. And you can see that it trended up into around the 1860 period when it got more mentions than at any other time. And since then it's been declining. And even though there's more Great Bustard activity to talk about in a few minutes, it hasn't really come back up again. So it's quite interesting that pattern, why after I think the Victorians were quite regretful that they managed to exterminate all the Great Bustards. There's a lot of discussion about it in the press, but there was even 1 or 2 limited reintroduction programs tried around 1900 in Norfolk, but they weren't successful. Well, the interesting period, so that Great Bustard in South Roresby was built in 1860, at a time when interest in Great Bustard seems to be at its height. So whether there was a genuine tradition of Great Bustards living locally or breeding locally, or whether it was just a made-up story to give a good name to the pub, who knows? So, although the tradition of Great Bustards in Lincolnshire isn't that great, that's not true in other counties. So in Wiltshire and Cambridgeshire, for instance, Great Bustards were popular enough to make it onto their county crests. So that's the county crest of Wiltshire with the Great Bustard on the top. And this is the county crest of Cambridgeshire with, I'm not sure what the proper words for these Great Bustard rampant, maybe supporting this heraldic symbol in the middle, who knows? Anyway, the important point to note is that these heraldic devices didn't come into existence until 1937 and 1914, respectively. So a long time after the Bustards had disappeared from those counties, but obviously they retained a connection and a sort of a culture of having a connection with Great Bustards. But even more interestingly, it's fair to say that the tradition of Great Bustard existence in Wiltshire was probably stronger than anywhere else, particularly on Salisbury Plain. And it's there that a really serious reintroduction campaign started around 25 years ago. And that project's run by the Great Bustard Group, which is led by David Waters, who is a Wiltshire born and bred lad, former policeman, and he's an absolute enthusiast for Great Bustards. And it's an important project because Great Bustard is suffering a decline in population. It's red listed. It's declining in the Spanish stronghold, and BirdLife have it down as vulnerable, making it the most globally important bird of conservation concern that Lincolnshire and Britain has lost. So it is a very important bird in conservation terms, and not just in conservation terms, but in people's ability to relate to a bird in the environment. Great Bustards are something a bit like cranes. They're big enigmatic birds that people can relate to. So I'll tell you a little bit about the reintroduction project because it's very fascinating. Obviously, you can't just go around and start finding some Great Bustards and releasing them. You have to get licensed and put forward a case to the authority, the DEFRA, that you should be able to have a license to do this, which the Great Bustard Group did. And then they had to get hold of some bustards. Now, at the time, DNA science was not very well advanced, so specimens that were known to be British specimens from the 18th and very early 19th centuries were examined for DNA and compared to other populations, and it was thought that the closest DNA match was to the Russian population. So David Waters, having initially contacted German authorities to try and get some Great Bustards from Germany, wasn't successful because they're still in a very precarious state in Germany and they're building up their own numbers. But he got in touch with the Russian authorities in the Saratov area of southern Russia and came to an arrangement with them whereby bustard eggs that were bound to be destroyed in agricultural operations will be taken into care, the eggs hatched in Russia, and once the young were hatched, the young would be transported to Russia for release on Salisbury Plain. And that happened for 5 years, well, maybe longer, 8 years, from 2004 to 2012. Now, the problem was that, well, these birds did not do that well. They tended to get predated and they tended to migrate as soon as the weather changed. So, and a lot of them went south to France. And although there was some success and the first birds raised young, laid eggs in 2009, the population didn't grow as well as they had hoped it was. And they came to recognize that the problem was that they were transporting these young bustards in vehicles from Russia to Britain by driving them straight across in about 3 days, releasing them on Salisbury Plain. When they looked at them in more anatomical detail, they discovered that the stress of this journey was causing the feathers to weaken, which was giving them a difficulty in escaping from predators. So around this, based on all this information, a paper was done, published in IBIS, saying, well, the Great Bustard the reintroduction is ongoing, but it's not going very well and there's not much establishment. But around this time, the EU put loads of funds for a Great Bustard project across Europe. So for 3 years, the RSPB came on board, fueled by all this money from the EU, and they forged some new links. Coterminous with this was a new paper on the DNA of Great Bustards that showed the Great Bustards in Spain were much more closely related to the ones in Britain than the ones in Russia. So totally reversing the initial findings. So they made arrangements with Spain to go out there, and instead of collecting eggs that will be damaged, lost through agricultural operations, on the basis that great bustards will relay if their eggs are taken very early, taking those eggs to Britain within 24 hours, taking them to Bird World in the Cotswolds, where they were hatched, and then immediately transporting them to the plain, where they had a centre where the birds could be raised directly on the ground on Salisbury Plain, and then released as they grew big enough. And those releases, that arrangement went from 2014 to 2019, when the last eggs were transported from Spain. And that has been reasonably successful. There's now a group of about 100 great bustards on Salisbury Plain, across the whole plain. You know, the numbers are slowly growing without further releases. So these are some chicks, which have been just hatched out before they're all ringed, before they're kept in very small pens, and then larger pens, and then a very large pen before the gates open and they can free fly. And of course, the later ones were able to see the adult birds that were free roaming in the immediate area, and they joined the droves of the adult birds that are already out there now. So they've had a lot more success in the last 10 years than they did in the previous 10 years. And they still rear birds because they have a very intensive program to try and record all the great bustard nests that are out there. Some of them in Britain are going to be at risk of damage through agricultural operations. So if that's the case, they'll take those eggs and hatch them and release the birds back into the droves. So as I said, there's now a population of 100 birds. One of the problems that they had was that young birds that are released without any parental guidance at all are prone to predation by foxes and move to unsuitable habitat. And there's really no substitute for a mother's care. But there's a nice male great bustard. But they have a very complicated social life, great bustards. So at different times of the year, they will split into single sex or multi-sex groups. They have a Lecking breeding system. So the female chooses the male she perceives as best to mate with. And this makes them extremely difficult to breed in captivity, because breeding in captivity is one of the classic ways of helping birds that are endangered to come back, like lammergeister, for instance, in Southern Europe, or the Californian condor in America. But breeding in captivity has proven very difficult in close quarters. I've had some success in Germany, but it's a kind of, in Germany, they've built massive enclosures, maybe 400 or 500 acres with big fences around them, so nothing can get in. So the birds can live as naturally as they can without actually being totally wild. And they've had some success in those sort of situations, but in a smaller context, nobody has had any success. It is possible to breed great bustards through artificial insemination. And that is done in Spain. There's a firm in Andalusia that does it. But how much do you think an individual great bustard costs that's been bred through artificial insemination? Good, the right answer. Well done. That's how much they are. And you know, if you're going to try and have a release program that releases 20 a year for 5 years, at 20,000 a pop, that is not a very cost-effective way to do it. So that's not happening unless a millionaire shows up somewhere, or maybe a billionaire more like. Very amazing display. The male throws his head back and pluses out his neck feathers and his wings and makes himself look incredibly dramatic. And it's possible when they're displaying like this, if you look at one at a long distance, to mistake them for sheep because of all those white fluffy feathers from the coverts. So given suitable protection, the Great Bustard will spread naturally. I visited this project myself in just before lockdown in 2020, and we'd arranged to go on a particular date. And the day before, we went to Stonehenge, because I hadn't been there since a child. And I don't know if you've been to Stonehenge in recent years, but the whole layout has been changed. You can't park anywhere near it. You have to park about 1.5 miles away and either walk or get a coach. So naturally, I was planning to walk. So I get out of my car in the car park, scan around, and Salisbury Plain is about 10, 12 miles from where the Great Bustard Research Group is based and where they have their release area. The first thing I see is 5 Great Bustards in a field, which was a magical moment, because it just goes to show that they are relatively wild birds. They're on the 3rd generation now, and apparently there are now 5 or 6 droves all over Salisbury Plain. The birds have naturally spread across Salisbury Plain. So how quickly they'll spread to other areas is not really clear yet without human intervention. Preparations are being made to put areas on the Sussex Downs into a good condition for Great Bustards, and also in the Norfolk Suffolk Wrecks, there's big conservation groups. Agglomerations of big farming estates, and they're very motivated to see the Great Bustard return to East Anglia. But one of the difficulties is getting hold of the birds. As I said, they cost for a lot to buy if you just get them from artificial insemination. There's not enough birds around really to expect the group on Salisbury Plain to share them. I spoke to David Waters about it, and he reckons they've probably got this year about 120 birds, but he wouldn't be happy to give birds away to other populations until they get to 450. So that's probably going to take 20 years at least before they get to that point. As I say, they're now on the 3rd generation, and a number of broods are being raised every year without any human intervention at all. And the sight of I haven't actually seen this site, but the sight of Great Bustard chicks following their mother must be a really great one to see. By the way, anybody can visit the Great Bustard group. You just go online and pick out a date that you want to go, and they'll take you around, and you'll get good views of the drove that lives immediately around the release area where their base is. And naturally raised Great Bustards are obviously a lot better than or have a lot better survival potential than those that are raised in captivity, or partial captivity, as it were. So there's still plenty of open habitat in Lincolnshire that could hold Great Bustards. The Lincolnshire wolds really are not that difficult to get into a condition that Great Bustards could return someday. One of the problems is that the Great Bustard Group have done all this work by raising donations primarily. They weren't really impressed with the RSPB contribution. The RSPB were involved for 3 years while our EU money was around, but as soon as that dried up, they went away and didn't really support them anymore. So one of the difficulties is that because is with what constitutes a wild bird on the British list, this population on Salisbury Plain are not considered wild birds yet, and they won't be considered wild birds until the BOU elevates them to category C5 of the British list. And category C5 is the category for birds that formerly were native to the UK but have now been renaturalised. So it's a very small and select group of species that are on that list. Does anybody want to shout some of them out? Or shall I? Sorry?
Crane.
Crane is one of them, yeah.
Capercaillie.
Yep, Capercaillie.
Red kite.
Yep, the red kite's in England. And
Hen area soon.
hen area quite likely soon, yeah, I'll come on to that in a bit. And there's one more. It's a big one. Even that's right. Yeah. So all those birds have got, all those birds that have been subject to release have all got full protection. But until the Great Bustard has what the BOU consider to be a self-sustaining population, they won't get the legal protection of being a part of the British list. And if they're not on the British list, they won't get any money from DEFRA to help them help farmers provide habitat and facilities that would assist Great Bustards in their spread. So it's a bit of a bust and egg situation, really, as to whether the birds will be able to spread on their own with a bit of voluntary support, or whether DEFRA will step in and, under these new environmental arrangements that are supposed to be coming in, make funds available that would help other groups to establish Great Bustards as well. I mean, I can tell you that having spoken to some farmers of big estates on the Lincolnshire Wolds, there's a lot of appetite to see bustards back on the Lincolnshire Wolds, but getting the conditions right requires some farming changes that some farmers would do voluntary, but most who aren't that bothered would want some support for it. So, as I say, there's plenty of open habitat on the Wolds. If you go down to Salisbury Plain, you can recognise the bird community quite easily to that which you see on the Wolds. There's lots of skylarks, meadow pipits, there's quail, but they've also got a few other species that we've lost. I mean, there's lots of grey partridges, which there are in places still on the Wolds where they're not shot. So some of the other birds that exist on Salisbury Plain still are birds that we've lost, and I'm going to come on to talk about those now. Yeah, so the Great Bustard, when it was around in Lincolnshire, was part of a bird community that included quail, still here, stone curlew gone, grey partridge still here, hen harrier gone, skylark still here, windchat gone, and cornwall still here, or hanging on. And the one that I want to talk about first is a stone curlew. Like the Great Bustard, stone curlew was lost from the Wolds with enclosure by the early 19th century, but it clung on until the early 20th century in the Scunthorpe area. Scunthorpe only came into existence really at the end of the 19th century. Before that, the area was known as Frodingham, and Cordeaux, in his book in 1872, Birds of the Humber district, referred to that area as Frodingham. And it was a massive sandy waste, very much like the Brecklands, stretching from Gainsborough virtually up to past north of Scunthorpe. And that is an area where Great Bustards could have bred. Stone curlews hung on there until agricultural intensification saw the back of them. Well, it's important to note that great stone curlews still breed extensively in southern England, and the RSPB have supported a big recovery programme for them over the last 30 years. They're still in Wiltshire, and basically all the habitats that Great Bustard was in, all the way up to Norfolk. So the nearest breeding stone curlews are in Norfolk. There are not that many stone curlews seen in Lincolnshire. It's still quite a rare bird. We only get a handful every decade. And one of the encouraging things is with the booming population in Norfolk is that these birds are migratory. They stay in Norfolk quite late into October, November, and then they migrate in quite big flocks down to Spain, North Africa, where they winter. And they come back quite early in March. And the ones that we do get are probably returning birds overshooting from Norfolk. And it might just be farmers' chat, but I've spoken to farmers on the Wolds who reckon they've had stone curlews on their fields. It's not in the birding literature. There's no formal identification of proper records of it. Might all be rubbish, but some farmers believe that they've had stone curlews on their fields. So one of the ways that we could move towards getting the sort of conditions that Great Bustards would be to try and encourage stone curlews to return. And in the areas where stone curlews breed, one of the great ways to get them is to have what very similar to lapwing plots, stone curlew plots that are ploughed areas that are left, they develop a sort of weed population and insects and seeds there that stone curlews can nest in and feed their chicks in without too much disturbance. And similar areas are used on the Lincolnshire wolds for lapwings with varying degrees of success. But it is possible to attract stone curlews by playing their calls at night. So you could envisage a project on the wolds that created habitat that was good for stone curlew, well, good for, to get the financial support, because there's no stone curlews in Lincolnshire, farmers would have to have lapwing plots. It could also be attractive for stone curlews with tapes we call, I don't know if you know, but stone curlews are very active at night, and most of their activity, and particularly their breeding behaviour, takes place at night, and they call at night. They have a very blood curdling call, you could call it. So you could play those tapes at night with a prospect of encouraging in early March with a prospect of encouraging birds. So that will be an interesting project, and it's one that I'm looking at in a sort of very loose way with some farmers on the wolds. Another bird that we've lost that was in that community is the windchat, which is one of the most delightful birds and still quite common in Lincolnshire on migration in the spring and in the autumn. And these birds used to, well, according to Cordo, in the mid-19th century, the windchat was one of the commonest birds in Lincolnshire. And the reason was that they bred in hay meadows. And there were lots of hay meadows about because there were lots of horses around needing to farm the arable land. And the horses needed a lot of hay to keep them going. And it was in those hay meadows that the windchats bred. When the horses went, the windchats went as well. And they clung on in the county until the 1880s in the sort of Isle of Axholme area, where there were heathy areas with sort of rough grazing and gorse, which they favour breeding. But they petered out in Lincolnshire in the 1980s, and nobody even knows when the last one bred. It was just very unfortunate that the sight was lost of them. But you might ask, could we encourage these birds to stay and to stop and breed since they're passing in spring and going back in autumn? And probably the answer is no. Stonechats tend to, windchats return to the areas from which they were bred. And since they've not been bred in Lincolnshire for 100 years or more, they won't be returning to Lincolnshire. Increasing work is being done on passerines, breeding them in captivity and releasing them into an area. So they like heft to that area and return to it. That's been done with searle buntings in the southwest in Cornwall and Devon. But the windchat's migratory, and there is evidence that migratory birds bred in captivity can still successfully migrate. From corncrakes have been bred in captivity and released, and they've gone off to Africa for the winter and come back because the migration is so wide into their genes. So it's possible that if we wanted to, we could make an effort to get windchats back. The next bird that we've lost is hen harrier. And hen harrier in the 19th century was a very common bird in Lincolnshire. Somebody in the 1830s counted around 30 nests in the market raising area. I can't remember the exact number, but it was a very large number. It was somewhere between 20 and 30. So they were a very common bird, but they were eliminated by shooting because, probably quite rightly, it was felt that they took game bird chicks and reduced their populations. So there's still a lot of controversy over what hen harriers choose to feed their chicks on. And that's led to a project that's come about in the last couple of years that is pejoratively called brood meddling, where hen harrier nests that are found on grass shooting estates, the chicks are taken into captivity, hatched, and then re-released. And the re-release area that's been chosen is Salisbury Plain. So these and it's only been happening for the last year or so. Hen harrier broods have been hatched in captivity, released on Salisbury Plain, and it's hoped that they will breed on Salisbury Plain and start a population there. And I mean, there's all sorts of arguments for and against that, and lots of people feel that we shouldn't encourage the criminality of gamekeepers in killing hen harriers for reducing their grass chick numbers. But that aside, the only way that hen harriers are going to be reintroduced to southern England is to do something like this, move the chicks and release them in areas where they're going to return to when they're adult and breed.
Didn't they predate the bustard chicks?
Possibly, yeah.
Is that counter?
Yeah, I mean, and talking to David Waters, one of the problems they've got on Salisbury Plain now is that ravens have spread onto Salisbury Plain,
Yeah.
and not every raven, but one raven in particular has developed a taste for Great Bustard eggs. So, but it's all part of life, isn't it? These things balance out in the long run if you have enough birds. So the point I just wanted to make is that, again, the technology and experience and practice is increasingly there that if we wanted to see hen harriers return to Lincolnshire, it would be possible to make arrangements to have them released. Of course, it needs the agreement of the landowners, because, and there may be pheasant shooting estates that wouldn't want them here, but the fact is hen harriers predate very small grass chicks, and very few pheasants are bred naturally anymore. They're all imported as poults, kept in pens and released, by which time they're far too big for a hen harrier to take. But, you know, there is a massive prejudice in the gamekeeping against anything with hook feet. So there'd probably be a lot of resistance to it. What I'm saying is that, you know, the potential is there. So who knows? But while Great Bustard is a flagship bird, we might as well end on a positive note. Over the last 400 years, Lincolnshire has lost cranes as well, but they've returned. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Willow Tree Fen story now. Links Wildlife Trust established a fen reserve from bare agricultural land, arable land, 10, 12 years ago. Andy here did the initial surveys on it when it was still farmland before it was returned to fenland. And when it did return to fenland, the habitat was such that in 2020, during the first lockdown, a pair of cranes was attracted to nest there, and they successfully raised a chick in 2020. In 2021, they were raising 2 chicks, which mysteriously disappeared. And then in 2022, they raised 2 chicks again. And there are reports of other pairs of cranes appearing around the county. And it's possible that we could see in the next 2 or 3 years, several pairs of cranes breeding in the county. So that is a fantastic success story, but it's only really happening because the RSPB got together with people like Pensthorpe Wildlife Trust and the Wildlife and Wetlands Trust, and put a lot of effort into intensively breeding cranes in captivity and releasing them all around the country, mainly down in the Somerset levels, but they've spread quite successfully. There's a big population in Cambridge. There was a very, very small population in Norfolk that was probably natural from Scandinavian immigrants that started around the late 1970s. But this augmentation by birds released from captivity has been extremely successful. And, you know, you've got to congratulate the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust and their vision for creating that habitat, which has allowed these birds to return. But all I'd like to say, wouldn't it be great to see a more complete community of birds back on the Lincolnshire Wolds? I think it's eminently possible. All we really need is a vision and leadership to make it happen. So I'll just do a quick plug for our book. If you want to know a bit more about the birds that we've lost, and a lot of birds that have come back, there's lots of good stories, then you can read all about it in our aviform of Birds of Lincolnshire, published in 2021. I was going to say last year, but it's not last year anymore. And I've got some copies here if you want to have a look at them. And I'd just like to do a plug again for the Great Bustard group. If you want to know more information, you can look at their website. And if you're down in the south of England, I really recommend a day out to the Great Bustard group to have a look at their facilities and the birds that they've released. And I'd recommend going to Stonehenge as well. It's fantastic. I'd like to thank all the bird photographers from the county who've provided their images to the bird club so we can use them in presentations like this and our books. The crane picture came from Visit Lincolnshire, and that Busted Road concept came from Caitlin Green, who's got a really fascinating blog at caitlingreen.org if you're interested in Lincolnshire history. So thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to take any questions you may have.